My grandfather was drafted into the German army along with every able-bodied person right as the Second World War began in 1939, and immediately placed on a frontline unit, Unit 699, that was placed in the heart of Russia and moving through the Ukraine and into Russia in the southern flank. They were heading for the city of Baku, for their goal was to basically capture the oil reserves of the Russian armies and the Russian government. And being on a bridge-building unit right at the front lines, often behind enemy lines, there were huge amounts of casualties and a lot of heartache. One day, his commanding officer towards the end of the war called him into his office, his makeshift office, and asked him a very direct question. He said, "Herr Hasel, do you believe that Germany is going to win this war?" And the question was kind of a catch-22, because if you're a patriotic soldier, you're going to say, of course we're going to win this war. But also being a Bible student and as pastor and having studied prophecy, my grandfather knew that Germany would not win the war, and so he was conflicted and he didn't know exactly what to say, and at that moment he said a silent prayer to heaven, and then he said, "Is this an official or an unofficial question?" And they had kind of an unwritten code within their unit that when they had their hats off, they could speak on an unofficial capacity. And so the commanding officer stopped for a moment and then he said, "Okay, it's unofficial." And he took off his hat and placed it on his desk, and my grandfather did the same, and he pulled out a Bible from his pocket, opened it up to Daniel chapter 2, and began to tell the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And he said, "I don't believe that Hitler is correct. His empire cannot last 1,000 years as he's promising the German people. This war has to fail because of biblical prophecy and how everything has been fulfilled in the past."
Nearly 2,500 years ago, King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had a dream. Now, it's been said that this dream revealed the history of Earth from that time until today. Now, is this actually true? In order to find out, we need to go back to the book of Daniel.
Daniel was taken captive about 605 BC, according to the book. He was taken captive right about the beginning of the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar II, who established the resurgence of Babylon as a very strong power in the ancient Near East. He took a number of princes from the city of Jerusalem captive, one of whom was Daniel.
Well, it was not unusual that conquerors, kings who conquered the land, would take from royal families and nobility young people and take them with them to their own country. And it was mainly done for two reasons. One reason is that these young people will be educated in Babylon, and they would accept not only language of Babylonians, but they would accept culture and religion and everything from Babylon.
They would take the cream of the crop, the intelligentsia, the royalty. They would take the artisans, the writers, the physicians, so that their land was developed at a high level, but they would leave some of the people in the land and allow a local person to rule. That's exactly what happened with the time of Daniel. Daniel and his friends were taken from Jerusalem to Babylonia.
We find Daniel captive in Babylon. Now, Daniel chapter 1 tells us why he's there. Okay? Nebuchadnezzar had gone to Jerusalem in 3 separate raids.
The first one was in 605 BC. Then there was another one around 598 BC and another one around 586 BC. Each time the penalty against the people of Jerusalem was a little bit more severe. It may have been in that initial attack in 605 when Daniel and his friends, princes of the kingdom, were taken into captivity with the idea of training them and making them sympathetic supporters of the Babylonian crown.
This piece chronicles events from 605 to 594 BC, including Nebuchadnezzar's campaign into Palestine and the first capture of Jerusalem.
Daniel was probably brought back to Babylon on the first raid by Nebuchadnezzar. He comes to Babylon and he is enrolled in the schools of the Babylonians. He's given a Babylonian name, he's fed Babylonian food. He is enrolled in their schools in a kind of Babylonian brainwashing to prepare him to assimilate to Babylonian culture and language, and eventually to be a kind of puppet ruler over the Jews for the Babylonian Empire.
He risked his life by insisting on remaining pure in the way that he ate in his diet and so on, and what he drank, rather than just accepting the hospitality of the king. Now that was extraordinarily dangerous. And if you don't accept the hospitality, that is a serious insult. Now you see, that can be dangerous even if you're equals with somebody. But Daniel was not the equal with Nebuchadnezzar. He was a captive. He was being treated with a massive blessing and compliment from the king, the great king who had conquered all these other kingdoms, and yet he refused his hospitality. This was very dangerous, but God blessed him. He got through that, and he became much wiser than all of the other wise men.
One of the most fascinating stories in the Bible is the story of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar has dreams, the Bible says. It was his second year of his reign, and he wakes up completely disturbed because he's had this amazing dream, and like something that happens to so many of us, he wakes up and he doesn't remember what he dreamed.
He dreamt a dream that terrified the daylights out of him. Now, this has got to be quite a dream to terrify this kind of a king. He knows it's from the gods. He's just conquered all this territory, but it still frightens him. He doesn't know what it means. Obviously, to him, as many other people in the Near East thought, as well as Pharaoh in the book of Genesis, he thought this had something to do with him and his future and his kingdom, but he didn't know what. And what's more, in the morning he had that impression, but he forgot what the details of the dream were, so he couldn't even remember it.
It's fascinating. When you look at archaeological evidence, tablets that have been dug up from 6th century Babylon, we find that dreams were a common part of Babylonian existence, particularly among the priestly class, among the elite class. There was a whole school of how to deal with dreams. They had books on how to interpret and define dreams. So that description of the king having a dream and having someone come in to interpret it fits right in with the 6th century context.
The greatest attested genre of Babylonian literature that we have is divination literature, omens, like that. In other words, what I'm saying is that if you took all of the Babylonian written materials that we have and you put them all together in a library, the biggest section would be this one.
Babylon is steeped in religious meaning, connotations, overtones, undertones. And that's the world that Daniel lived in. And this is the context in which Nebuchadnezzar had this dream. He was filled, his life was filled with symbolism. And so for him to have received a dream that was so symbolic would have really meant something significant to him. He would have realized this is more than just a strange dream. It has meaning.
If a dream was not interpreted, it was perceived as dangerous, or it was perceived as a curse. That's why people had to fight for finding the interpretation of the dream.
So therefore he called all of his wise men who were supposed to deal with dreams and visions and interpreting them and omens and divination and all that stuff. And they were the ones who knew about the gods and how to get in touch with them. So he calls them all together. For some reason, Daniel wasn't there. We don't know exactly why. Maybe they just neglected to call him because he's a young colleague of the rest of them. We don't know. Maybe there was some politicking going on. Maybe some of the others were jealous, didn't want to call him. All right, so Nebuchadnezzar has all of these people, and he says, all right, I've had this dream, and I want you to tell me the interpretation. So they say, oh, that's fine. We're in that business. Tell us the dream. Oh, no. I don't remember the dream. You're going to tell me what the dream is.
And he goes so far as to say, I have decided firmly, if you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble.
He is demanding of these wise men that they tell the king the content of the dream. And they get upset. They know they're going to die if they don't do this. And so they're really working hard against this. And you know what they do? They say, as it says there in Daniel 2:44, he says, now wait a minute, king. They're fighting for their lives now. There is no king on earth that would ever ask such a difficult question.
The king basically says, I'm not going to be persuaded by your time-saving tactics. Okay? if you tell me what the dream is, then I can have confidence in your interpretation. I don't remember what the dream was, and that's what I need you to do for me. After all, you're the magicians, you're the astrologers, you're the soothsayers. Tell me the dream. They were paid, they were enrolled, they were on the divine payroll for the purpose of knowing what others didn't know. They had access to secret information, and so it was reasonable for the king to ask this.
And so the king decides that he's going to have them all killed. All of his top advisors, all of his magicians, astrologers, his sorcerers, his enchanters, and the story or the decree comes to Daniel and his 3 friends.
And they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Now, Daniel, as we've already said, had gone through the schooling of the Babylonians. And so he was apparently numbered with the wise men. He was numbered with those that were being killed. As the story unfolds, one of the king's guards arrives at Daniel's house for the purpose of executing him. That must have been awkward, right? Knock, knock, knock. Hello, what can I do for you? Daniel? Yes, I'm here to kill you. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree from the king so urgent? What's going on here? Why all the haste? Why all of the urgency?" Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. He must have said something like, "Well, listen, the king's had a dream. He can't remember the dream, but he knows it's important. He has an anxiety associated with this dream." So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation.
Instead of fearing for their lives, they decide to have a prayer time together. And Daniel asks, and his friends ask, that the Lord would give them not only the interpretation of the dream, but the dream as well.
And so the first word of verse 19, then the secret was revealed. What do you mean then? Well, after he prayed, after he asked. So Daniel at this point is rushed into the presence of the king.
And then Daniel explains to the king the dream. It's interesting, though, what Daniel says at the beginning. He says to the king, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about it, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come."
I can just imagine when Daniel came in and the king said with surprise, "Can you tell me the content of my dream?" And Daniel said, "I cannot tell you the dream because of my wisdom, but there's a God who reveals secrets." And the king was listening because that sounds good, but he hadn't heard the content of the dream yet.
Because remember, the king doesn't recall the dream. But you can be sure that if he starts to hear it, you know how that is when you can't quite remember something and someone says, "Oh, is it